Okay, I think we might be live. See if technology is serving us. Okay, I think we're good. Welcome to Peggy and Nora and Sanjay and Brandon, and to the folks who are joining the live chat. And thanks to folks, I see people already typing in where you're calling in from or where you're joining from. So please do keep doing that. It's fun to see where folks are joining the conversation and helping us build a bit of community online as well. So I am super excited about today's conversation on emergence and belonging. And rest assured we will, as Nora just reminded us, define what we mean by emergence so the group can grapple together. And I'm even more excited to be joined by a fellow member of the Building Belonging community, Brandon Dube. Brandon is a technologist, a network weaver, an entrepreneur, a community builder, and he's currently experimenting with a new cooperative venture called Crowdwork, which he can say more about. And he's been leading a body of work inside the Building Belonging community, exploring how we make decisions and how we move resources through our emergent network, thinking about principles of sociocracy, of consent-based governance, of warm data, following some of Nora's work, and other ways to think about how we can, as a community, operationalize what I think of as non-coercion. What does it look like to make decisions and share power in a different way? Belonging is core to Brandon's life and work, and I couldn't think of a better person to host today's discussion. So in a second here, I'll step back and I will be the one those of you on live stream will be interacting with in your comments. So if you have questions, please pitch them, and I'll do my best to make sure that Brandon and the group here sees them. Before I transition, a quick word about what this context and conversation is. So my name is Brian Stout. I'm a middle child, a mediator, a network weaver, father of 2 kids who may come barging into my room at any minute. And I'm based in Seattle. I'm helping shepherd an emergent collaborative called Building Belonging, which we are framing as an online home for people who are committed to building a world where everyone belongs. You can find out more about us at buildingbelonging.us. One thing we're doing this summer is hosting a series of what we're calling Conversations on Transformation, which are a set of about 20 conversations among advanced practitioners, like the one today, across a diverse range of disciplines, highlighting different aspects of how transformation happens for individuals, for societies, and for systems. And these are all viewed through the lens of belonging. Today's conversation is about the power of emergence and catalyzing systems change, but I trust our speakers will also apply the concept to individual and interpersonal transformation as well. So I'll join you again at the end, but for now, let me turn to Brandon. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Brian. Happy to be here with our esteemed panel. I think one of the things that is very present for me right now is the time period we're in. The types of crises that we're going through, from a global pandemic to economic and societal issues around justice and racial healing, as well as maybe even a larger frame of the climate. And all of these things are ever present with the topic at hand today around emergence. Today's conversation that I'm having with you all is about what conversations do we need to be having about the world and our roles as it pertains to emergence, and how we experience emergence within ourselves and our relationships. I really want this to be a fluid discussion, so feel free to direct it as needed. I know that Nora will have to leave us at the top of the hour, so I'm just nodding and acknowledging that. What I'd like to do is a really quick set of introductions. The prompt that I'll offer, and I'll start obviously myself, will be I am ... my people are ... and I belong to. And you can kind of take that as a frame to kind of help introduce the audience to yourself. For myself, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement of the Anacostine, the Nacatatank, and the Piscataway tribes whose land I'm sitting on today here in Washington, D.C. I am the son of an immigrant, an only child with a wide circle of kith I'm an American male holding African and African American identities, and also like a technologist and a digital monk. My people are cooperators, system thinkers, people who need people, consent-based governance folks, and many more. I belong to the community of building belonging, as well as the networks of ancestors and successors that will precede me. So I will pass it off to Nora to introduce yourself.
There we go, unmuted. I'm Nora, and I'm calling in today from Sweden, where I'm not from, but I live here. I moved here for love, and but I came from California, and I am interested in all sorts of things. I'm fascinated by what we know, how we talk about what we know, what information is, how response happens to that information. All of that is kind of embedded in a very long history of systems and complexity inquiry, um, or just life is another way you could put that. My people, it's funny, I don't think that I've ever started a sentence with my people. But I guess I am from some kind of, I'm in some kind of tribe of artists that are mixing um an exploration of life with science and art and history and identity and nature and gardens and kids and sexuality and all kinds of stuff together. I like to push the edges of expected scripts and the textures of language and communication. That's me. And I'll hand it over to Peggy.
Thanks, Nora. So I'm Peggy Holman. I live just outside Seattle, Washington, and in Bellevue with my husband. It's just the two of us, no kids, but I'm working on being a great aunt to my nephew and his wife's kids. And in this modern era, there are lots of pictures, so I get to participate and be kind of a voyeur and looking in on their lives as their kids are growing up. My people, yeah, I don't think I've ever started a sentence that way either. I come from Jewish immigrants. My grandparents, all four separately, fled Eastern Europe during the pogroms of the early 1900s because of violence against Jews. And picture Fiddler on the Roof. I mean, those are that's kind of the archetypical story of many of the Eastern European Jews who made it into the U.S. And I think that background has made me more aware of, more sensitive to, more in empathy and allyship with discrimination of all sorts. Certainly what we're experiencing today in the US and around the world. I belong to, I'd say people seeking to create a world that works for all, and doing that primarily through conversation and stories, which was my doorway into emergence. It led me, I come from a practice into theory kind of orientation, where having run into these interesting practices that let you bring large groups, diverse, often conflicted groups of people dealing with complex issues together and have useful stuff happen, led me on a quest to understand what makes that tick, what makes that possible. And that led me into following the threads of emergence. Um, and my work in communities, I started out working with change in organizations. And as I went out on my own, left large companies, I found myself more and more drawn to working with communities. Because the challenges were more complex, the need was greater, and it made my heart sing in a way that working in corporate settings it didn't, and ultimately led me to working with journalists and the application of the ideas um, and really recasting the relationship between journalists and communities to be more inclusive, constructive, and engaged. And I'm sure we'll be saying more about all of that as we continue, and I'll pass it on to Sanjay.
Thank you, Peggy. Hi, I'm Sanjay. I am currently in India, in Bangalore. I am one of the 1.3 billion Indians in this world, and delighted to be here. I'm a student because I believe I'm yet to learn a lot and looking forward to this day today to learn from everyone. I also believe that I'm a curious explorer because I'm always looking to find new answers to old questions or new questions themselves. I'm a dad of a biologist and partner of a language teacher. My spouse teaches the Indian language Hindi. I'm curator of ideas, of networks, of great minds. I'm a mentor to many social entrepreneurs, especially the ones who are anywhere between 20 to 25 years of age and trying to change the world, because that is where I draw my energy from. I'm also a hobby musician, which keeps me sane, especially in the time we're going through. I belong to a community of mission leaders who are extremely unreasonable in terms of the world that they want to see, who are pioneers in trying to figure out whether in our lifetime we can change the life of billions of people across this country and across the world. I belong to a community of people who have spent long time in corporate world. I took 26 years to graduate, very bad student at that. Took me 26 years to figure out how to graduate from corporate life, but I finally did in 2016. So I still have that community of a lot of great minds. I belong to a set of very, very kindred spirits who are attempting to do some amazing things at the foundation where I'm based at in Bangalore, and looking forward to the hour that will unfold ahead of us today. Back to Brandon.
So much. Awesome. Stellar introductions. All right, so let's get to the substance of today. When we talk about emergence, what does it mean to you, and why is this important for transformation and liberation? And I thought I'd start off with Peggy, since you have a book on emergence, and we can go from there.
Great, thank you. So I'll start with a somewhat technical but largely inaccurate but easy to understand definition. My short version is emergence is order out of chaos. And it's when you think about it from a technical point of view, there are a whole lot of caveats I would put around this. The book Brandon was referencing is Engaging Emergence, Turning Upheaval into Opportunity. And I discovered recently that if you type the phrase, "what is emergence?" into a search engine, that the first chapter of the book, because I have the text of the book actually online on my website, the first chapter is called What is Emergence? And it comes up very early on, which was kind of a fun and pleasant surprise. Um, I'm putting a link to that in the chat here, which I understand can be copied over to the live stream. And as I was preparing for this, I was reading what I said 10 years ago when I wrote this book, and the more technically accurate description or definition that I wrote was higher order complexity arising out of chaos in which novel coherent structures coalesce through interactions amongst the diverse entities of a system. That's a real mouthful. And essentially, emergence occurs through our interactions when they disrupt the status quo. They cause a system to differentiate, essentially to fall apart, which, as in the human experience, is both terrifying and exciting. And ultimately, through interactions and experimentation, um, a new set of assumptions form that coalesce into a stable enough system um, that it has some degree of longevity to it. In terms of what all that means and why care, emergence in human systems has produced everything from new technologies to forms of governance like democracy. And many would argue that consciousness itself is an emergent phenomena. So it applies in it's a name that gives us a handle for that interesting territory when something novel that makes a difference for us as an individual, for us in partnership, for us as a society emerges. And so from my perspective, a question that has guided me really through most of my adult life is, how do we change social systems? And I find in human systems, the use of conversation and stories are a pretty profound way in which the emergence of ideas, which then lead to different actions, behaviors, and outcomes take place. And what the book itself is about is a pattern that I think is pretty reliable and that I use for design work and to help me make sense in chaos like the times that we are experiencing now, that you can pretty dependently know comes about. So all change, all emergence begins with disruption, out of which things fall apart and begin to differentiate. And through lots of experimentation, we begin to notice the differences that make a difference, a phrase that I'm sure is familiar to the followers of Gregory Bateson. And ultimately, that leads to a new coherence, emergence arising, which seems like as good a place to stop as any in terms of my take on what is emergence. And I leave it to my colleagues to, to speak to how they make sense of this idea and how it applies.
Okay, Sanjay looks a little, are you there, Sanjay? You look a little frozen. Okay, would you like to speak to that, or should I jump in?
Yes, please jump in.
Okay, well, I think there's something about emergence that has to do with something becoming either perceivable or something coming out from some place where it wasn't graspable, it wasn't visible, it was somewhere, it might have been there all along, but it's been revealed. And so on top of everything that Peggy just said, I'm just going to put in another couple of little things around the edges. What's important to me about that is, first of all, yes, I mean, everything you just said, Peggy, is just so right up my tree. I mean, I cannot wait to talk warm data with you. We're going to have so much fun. But the way in which different ways and contexts of knowing, textures of knowing, overlap and interact with each other is often a way to kind of release insights or emergent perceptions. And the interesting thing is that it's not going to be managed or controlled. The thing about emergence that is both beautiful and difficult is that you don't get to say what happens. And maybe thinking that you know what's best for what could happen, maybe that's in itself a little bit of limited thinking and perceiving, because what's happening when complex systems are coming together is that there are all sorts of relationships in all sorts of directions, and they're all changing, and there's no way that any of us can possibly perceive all of that relational process taking place. No matter how many lists, no matter how big your map is, the complexity is bigger, and it's moving in ways that are beyond our perception. So on the one hand, that makes emergence, especially in times like these times, where I think, I don't know about you guys, but I just did my taxes today. And looking back at last year and into next year, I actually don't know if I can commit to going to do seminars. I don't know what's happening. I don't know what to say to anyone. I don't actually know what my way of being useful or contributing what I have to give to the world is right now. Like, I don't really know how to bring my work in. I love to be with people, and I can't do that. So what's emerging, what's coming out of that is one set of questions that I have. And another set of questions that I have is, and this is a little bit radical, but is what's going out of you? All right. While we're looking at what's emerging, what's submerging? Because there's always that balance of things coming in and out of you. And I want to be careful about the word emergence turning into furniture. Because if it gets too used and too familiar, the actual sparkles at the edges of it we won't be sensitized to those sparkles anymore. And I think that there's something about that that's really, it's necessary to feel enough familiarity and emergence that we don't contract into fear and turn it into binaries and try to control it. At the same time, not too much familiarity that one actually can just kind of throw the word around like, oh, that's just emergence, and then carry on. Which is, I'm seeing that. So I just want to bring that up here and just keep it as a hot potato. And I'll stop there and we'll just see what happens. What do you think, Sanjay?
It's a very important topic that I grapple a lot with. The attention that I have been paying to is large scale systems. And when I say large, well, India gives me a large enough scale system because that's a system of 1+ billion people. Complex systems, essentially, by that I mean unpredictable systems where we don't know what will be the first, second, third, fourth order effects of anything that you ripple through the system. And dynamic systems where problems shift and many a times they grow faster than the solutions themselves. And as I've been looking for inspiration as to what is the current situation, and it itself is an equilibrium. It may be an underperforming equilibrium, but it is an equilibrium. It is a place where left to itself, it would stay much to our dissatisfaction, and hence nobody would leave it where it is. And the question is, how do you move to a better performing equilibrium? And as we were looking for inspiration, my eyes turned to how we have evolved as species. And in my mind, that is a classic definition of emergence, all of us on the planet now. And there are various theories ranging from Darwinian theory to Stephen Gould's theory of punctuated equilibrium to the Cambrian radiation theory and so on and so forth. And essentially, in this entire quest, we figured out 3 important questions that we deal with, at least I've been grappling with when I think about emergence. One is, classically, everyone thinks that emergence is it about scaling what works, or is it about what works at scale? Right? Because scaling what works is replication. What works at scale is emergence, because divergent systems work at scale. Converging systems don't work at scale. And so I spend a lot of time trying to understand in education, in healthcare, in sanitation, urbanization, livelihoods, water, what works at scale. And how do you really, like Nora, you rightly pointed out, deal with varying contexts, deal with varying situations simultaneously. Not that, first I will deal with this situation and then I will deal with that situation. All these things coexist, and hence it's like all the species on the planet coexist, and nature has a way of dealing with them at the same time. It's the same question of all the contexts of people coexist. The second area where I try to think about emergence is it about distributing a solution, or it's about distributing the ability to solve? And that's a very important question for us, because emergent systems distribute the ability to solve because no one has the answer who can distribute a solution saying, hey, I have an answer, let me give it out. So that's the second thing. And third important question that we deal with, that I grapple with in emergence, is that small changes at scale create a much more emergent system than large answers or complete answers for a small part of the ecosystem. Whether it's in education, whether it's in healthcare, or whether it's in livelihoods, small things at scale again and again and again through cycles allow the system to bubble up. So I would sort of say that when I look at emergence from the lens of scale, then I try to sort of frame it into these 3 questions, saying what works at scale, how do you distribute the ability to solve, and how do you make small changes at very, very large scales, again and again and again, repeatedly, so that you allow the system to find its way rather than find the way for the system. That's the foundation on which our thinking is sort of shaping as of now. Of course, we continue to learn every day. Like I said, I'm a student, so I'm still learning. But these are the issues that we think about.
Um, I'm struck by, first off, I think one of the themes of not knowing, which is the nature of emergence. And I think we've been enculturated, certainly in the West, we've been enculturated to prize knowing above all else, to the extent that people will lie rather than admit they don't know something. But I think the coronavirus in particular has put us in a position where we're dealing with scale. And I'm looking at one of the questions from the live stream, what happens when things speed up? We're getting to watch a system affecting the world unfolding rapidly before our eyes, where there's way more that we don't know and are willing to admit we don't know than I can recall in certainly in my adult lifetime. And so it's been fascinating and daunting and exciting. All of those qualities of not knowing, of both huge opportunity and a great deal of fear and terror, at watching this thing evolve. You know, whether it's no, don't wear masks, to wear masks, to oh, it's spread by through the air, as we learn about new characteristics and we see the ripples on the economy and we see how it affects relationships. So it has been a massive lesson in emergence in action before our eyes, as we have dealt with massive disruption and now beginnings of experimentation on viruses and ways of treating, or on vaccines and ways of treating. And we're far from coalescing into any kind of stable resolution. So we are in the midst of it. And anyway, I think it speaks to some of the themes that I was hearing all three of us talk about.
I think it's so important to keep that in mind, because in this moment, there is so much change in so many different contexts that it's very difficult to know who we are, anyone, any we, whoever your people are. There's been the pandemic has given such a profound illustration of an intersystemic institutional failure in pretty much globally. Some countries did better than others, but they're still in the same global economic systems and so on and so forth. So there's a shared, at least a shared failure. And for some of us who've been looking at systems for some time, this was not really a surprise. But what happened was that intersystemic, interinstitutional failure that has taken place revealed for people who weren't maybe used to seeing it, that the education system and the health system and the financial system and the culture and the family and their geography and all of these things were not in discrete buckets. It really wasn't possible to keep them separate from each other. And this was actually a momentous shift in the ability to perceive emergence.
Mhm.
And of course, it took an emergency to do it. And it's not really an accident that those two words are related. It's just that there's, a moment when the notion of emergence can feel very beautiful and possible, and another moment when it's an emergency, when it feels like everything's going wrong at once. So it's all part of the same set of complex system contexts in motion. How it plays out is a question. And then the question is, who am I inside of that? So what I'm seeing right now that's so interesting is just this question of how do we even think about what information, identity, while we're in this transformation, so much of the things of the knowledge has been pinned to and strung back to various institutions or solid spots that aren't solid anymore. So there's some big movement. And one thing that I'm also curious about within this is I love to study it and to watch it and to be rigorous in that process. And certainly my work with communities around the world is bringing many of these things that we're discussing here together. And I love this this description that you made, Sanjay, of ability to solve versus scaling solutions, because I think that really describes what my work with warm data actually does. Is it's bringing to groups of people an embodied experience of complex systems from which they have the ability to meet other complex systems, other complex situations. Instead of saying, here's a solution, it's much more like, here, we're going to work with the way that we're perceiving and describing things and see how that shifts the way you can then respond. So when I was saying what's submerging, because I see that in the chat someone wanted me to get at that a little bit. One of the things that's submerging is a sense of certainty, or a sense of identity that had more firm edges, a sense of there's something happening where, the history that a lot of the world learned in school turns out to have been just one small fraction of the story. And that's become very evident. It's not so easy to think about or raise your kids and think about what it is to be a good person, when everything in your household is produced with exploitation. So what's submerging? And for me, some of what's submerging right now is a sense of certainty as to how one should be in the world. And I've never really been that prone to that certainty, but still I feel it. I feel it, in the conversations around the ways in which the exploitation has taken place. How do we look in our own living rooms and see all the manifestations of that? So what's emerging for me is some questions. Is this a time to know, or is this a time to allow that tumble in the waves? Yeah.
Sanjay, I'd love to give you a chance to respond.
It's fascinating how. Hello. Yeah, I was just reflecting on a couple of interesting dots that when I asked this question saying, so what works at scale? The real answer to that question is, I don't know. That's the correct answer to that question. What works at scale? We don't know. And so what do we do when we don't know? And that's when not knowing the context is a blessing, because what we realized in our system design was when we don't know the context, we allow it to unbundle. We allow it to fall apart. And so when we were looking at education or healthcare, we realized that because we don't know the context, why don't we take the problem and split that into context independent, context aware, and context intensive components? And let different people look at different parts of this ecosystem rather than anyone trying to understand all of it, because no one can at scale. It's impossible to do it. So not knowing the context is something that we are extremely fond of, because it's like the people who build the GPS don't need to know why are you using it. They just need to know how to make it work. The people who are building the map don't need to know whether you will take a ride today or not. And the people who are actually giving you the ride need to know where you are and where you want to go. And that is a classical delayering or breaking of context. Because to allow a system to emerge, we have to allow the system to deal with context in a distributed fashion rather than trying to centralize the context into what we are trying to do. I think what Peggy said, saying our gift is the acceptance that I don't know. What Nora said, that not knowing the context is probably sometimes a very interesting place to be in, and letting it emerge. And I felt that, yes, that resonates a lot, because when I look at designing systems, I'm always starting with this place saying, I don't know, and can we unbundle the context and allow different players, different actors, different minds to actually emerge with some context independent answers, some context aware answers, and some context intensive answers. And can we bring it together into what I term as a unified but not uniform system? How do you design a unified but not uniform system? Because without that, we cannot embrace the scale. For example, an education project that I work with is focused on literacy and numeracy of 200 million children. A financial inclusion project that looks at economic stability of 100 million households. Such large systems have to be emergent systems, because the context of 100 million families, nobody can claim to ever know. And so you have no choice but to design an emergent system, a system that distributes the ability to solve, because nobody knows what is the answer to that system otherwise. It was fun to connect what you were saying. I learned today that we are thinking about similar problems in different parts of the world.
I want to jump in on that, Sanjay, because I'm actually quite intrigued, because my approach to design in many ways, on the surface at least, sounds like it comes from almost the opposite point of view, which is, how do we deal with the not knowing? And the strategy that I have found successful in working at the scale of systems, typically organizational kinds of systems, is to begin with a question that is ambitious enough and attractive enough that it draws from the disparate parts of the system, and that we very consciously do our best to bring the diversity of the system forward, such that nobody has to know all of the answer, but by being present together and creating the conditions for people to interact with others around a question that they all care about, that they begin to see themselves as a system, and out of that, novel answers emerge. So, for example, this is kind of my origin story of what caught me in this work. In a corporate setting, many years ago at this point, um, it was with a phone company. There had been flooding in the state of Arizona. We had 250 people that we brought together that included management, network technicians, et cetera. The people who made up the system, who cared about what was going on. And over the course of 2.5 days, in the background, labor management negotiations were going on. So labor and management didn't exactly see eye to eye or get along very well. And by the end of it, there were union folks who were cheering management to hire, encouraging them to hire a contract labor, which was a serious no-no for unions. But they now had a picture of the whole in the way that they never had before, such that the they saw the use of contract labor as a help because they could go deal with the daily stuff, and that freed the technicians of the system to deal with the deeper issues in the system. So the solution that I come to is not so much unbundling, but asking the question, who makes up the system and how do we bring them together in a productive way, such that, and I find that the turning point occurs when when the needs of individuals and the needs of the whole system are both met, as I began to see in that particular example. And I'm sorry for the background noise. I'm going to go shut the door.
In my work, what I'm exploring in particular is this process, kind of somewhere between both of you, of recognizing that there's no way that you're going to know it. It's never going to happen. Forget it. But also that there appears to be some amount of contextual overlap that can take place, at which point there is a different sense of what's happening in the system, which is not to say that that's a prescriptive. What it is an aesthetic, actually. It's some sort of a tonality or a texture. What's interesting about all these interrelating contexts is not the list of the context, which I think speaks to your point, Sanjay, that if you can make, lists of stakeholders all day long, it's not actually going to tell you very much about the complexity of the system. Because what's actually in there is the relationship between them. And that is moving in multiple directions simultaneously, right? All of us inhabit lots of contexts at the same time. And so when we are in communication with each other, we are moving, shifting fields of inter-trans contextual process. So it's very difficult to ever get a grip on the whole thing, or half the thing, or even to put metrics on that. But there is something that happens, which I think this, in the warm data lab process or the people need people process, what we're doing is creating the conditions in which these overlaps are taking place through people through their stories, through their inputs, through their professional knowledge, through just the random coming together of them and moving multiple contexts at the same time into the conversation. But you could easily come out the other side of one of those sessions and not really know that anything happened. What happened? There wasn't some definitive demarcation of some knowledge that we're going to harvest now. Instead, it's much more of a shift of the way in which whatever you're doing later that day or the next meeting or the next project, the approach and the entry into that next piece is highly informed by these crossing contexts. And Brandon, you did one, so you can speak to that. So I guess there's something I really worry about with the eagerness to create scaled solutions. And I think that I'm in good company here today, that you are my people. because if you, and I've seen this, I know you have too, if there is the impulse to create a solution that works for communities and then put it in lots of different communities, I think we can all agree that the odds of that being generative of any vitality or well-being or possibility is pretty slim. That kind of solutioning has the danger actually of being something in kinship to some kind of colonialism. It's at that level. You have to be very, very careful, particularly when metrics are involved. So how to respond, and Sanjay, I can't wait to hear more about your work, to large scale systems change. And we got to get together, because really what I'm doing on the other side is basically, how do we prepare communities to be ready to respond to conditions of emergence? But beyond that, the other pieces kind of they come into play on their own. So I guess that's where I am in the sort of the in-between of you both. But laying the conditions for this murky thing to come out, and it doesn't really have a place to sit on the committee. It doesn't have a place to sit in the strategy. It's hard to say what the deliverable is. You can't really measure the impact of it.
So Nora, I know you have to run.
Oh, you're right.
But if you could offer one practice to help people build a bit of comfort with uncertainty, what might it be?
I mean, really, it's the zooming in and zooming out, and that those processes are not two separate processes. So it's the simultaneous detail in the larger context, and practicing that type of perception, whether you're thinking about your own identity and the complexity of the tiny little microbiome creatures, all the way out to your larger ideas, language, culture, etc. And that the people with you are also embodying that same degree of complexity, different details, but the details and the larger context are working together. That's how stories happen. And I guess the other thing is just, what kind of relationships build more relationships? Instead of thinking of the project having this goal, what happens after that? What's happening in the relationships that are spun out of that? And those schools that you're working with, what kind of relationships are people making with knowledge with each other, with older generations, with younger generations, with different cultures, with language, and how do those relationships go on to inform how they are in the world? Something like that. You guys, I have to go. I'm so sorry. Have a great finish of this, and I'll watch the recording. Thanks everybody who's watching. Thank you, Brian.
Wow. Yeah, who wants to pick it up?
Yeah. I want to loop back, Sanjay, to what I think is an extraordinarily important insight that I know I'm taking from this exchange from you is the emphasis on the ability to solve rather than the solving of. Um, I think that speaks to what Nora was talking about at the end of how do we prepare communities to be ready to respond.
That has been a very important learning in, I should say it is a very important learning because it's present continuous, it's not past. And because the three underpinning constructs that we are working through is the construct of agency, dignity, and choice. What is the meaning of this at scale? How do you restore the agency of a very, very large scale system? How do you ensure that missions and creations and people responses are in context of what do they see as strengthening, improving, and enabling their dignity? And what is the meaning of choice? And it's not like choice is handed down. What is the meaning of creating your choices rather than responding to choices others create for you? What does that mean in a large scale system? And that is sort of three core values, if you will, that we've been trying to see how do you then manifest that into an emergent system. Because even if it took one of them, for example, the question of restoring agency, and we talked about distributing the ability to solve, and we realized that when we work with very large systems, it always starts with deepening a sense of what do I really have? This whole idea of distributing the ability of solve is rooted in the question saying, what do I have? What can I do with it? And then what do I wish for? And then go on this cycle through the system again and again, which we call as I have, I can, I wish. And how much of that wish is again back to my have can wish, and the sense of I can do what I need to do in my context. It's a very, very, very complex process because we're talking of socioeconomic factors, environmental factors, there are political factors at play, there's demographics at play, there's history, there's so much going on, but the whole idea is how do you design a system, and probably sometime we can spend some time on actually looking at some of the systems that we have designed are in motion. Maybe today may not be enough time, but maybe in the consequent conversation to try and learn as to what does it take to restore. For example, if you look at the Indian education system, it's made of 1.5 million schools. There are 13 million teachers serving about 350 million children. What does it take for that system to emerge in the direction that people get a sense of agency, dignity, and choice? Is a super complex question. And what do you make? What is designed for it? What do you build? Do you build cultural systems? Do you build habits? Do you build technology? Do you build policies, regulations? What do you need to build to mobilize a system at scale? And that has been the journey of learning for us. And so far what we have understood is three things. One is how do you build more and more open infrastructure as a public good? What does that even mean? Second thing is, how do you build communities of creators and creative people who can solve problems in their respective contexts, not solve problem for a certain person. And third is, how do you create network effects? What Nora was talking about, how do you create network effects or interactions between people who work for the government, who work for civil society, who work for the private sector on issues that matter to us as a society? How do you create those virtuous value exchanges? What does it even mean? And how do you do that at scale? Uh, and so that's the journey. What I call as, it's, you can design intuitively emergent systems, but we are trying to design probably systematic emergent systems, which is like an oxymoron. Because what is systematic emergent? So that's the struggle, saying, how can you induce emergence, which is a weird phrase, because it sort of does not stack up together. But that's the quest, saying, can you make it happen?
So I want to build on that. My work at scale has been in journalism, and it has been about a 20-year journey in looking at the question of how do you change the social system. And I chose journalism because my experience in working in organizational settings was, if you want to change a culture, then change the stories that it tells. And journalists are cultural storytellers and work at scale. Um, and that was why I chose them. And in the 20 years of working with them, the um, early on, we introduced the notion of bringing the whole system together in conversation with itself, which we would do by bringing, print in the early days, print, broadcast, and new media people together. And as what is a journalist became more and more of a question, we brought in technologists and librarians and of course, audience and allies and media reformers and a larger scope of folks. And what has grown out of that, mostly over the last 5 years, has been a growing number of journalists and journalism organizations that have what they call an engagement editor. And we have helped seed a movement. It's still happening mostly at the local and regional level. It hasn't yet made its way into national news, but where the value of shifting the relationship between communities and journalists is central to it. And goodness knows, in terms of journalism's role as a keeper of white supremacy in place. We are beginning to see the cracks in that as more journalists of color are both moving into positions of greater responsibility and authority, and that journalists are engaging their communities in much different ways, asking different questions. And so with that as kind of an example of a shift that is underway, and like most or all emergent phenomenon, it follows a power law where you see no change, you see no change, then you begin to see just this tiny uptick. And I think that we may be at the point where there are enough journalists who are now beginning to think and work in a different kind of relationship to their communities. We may begin to see it more visibly at scale. So I want to talk about the design pattern that I have come to work with, which came out of my work 10 years ago that led to engaging emergence. And I'm going to share in the chat here a link to a chapter that is kind of my shorthand uh, version. This is an unpublished chapter that was supposed to be for a book that ended up not coming about. But on page 4 of it is an image that I call design for emergence. This is kind of like your term induced emergence. I actually have a friend who used the term planned emergence to describe this picture, and it made me shudder when I heard him use that. But what I would say is it's a pattern um, that I think is predictable enough that it informs the approach that is unique in every instance of application. And it begins with this notion that all change begins with disruption. So, and I saw this question in the chat. We can't control or manage it. So, what do we do? And because disruption is something that is so emotionally unsettling for most of us, the experiments through the years, the practices I've found that certainly enable me as an individual, and I think enable systems to deal with disruption. Um, and I think of this as cultivating a field of compassion and curiosity. And I find there are three elements that go into doing that. The first is to ask a question of possibility, a generative question of some sort, which I hear you innately do, Sanjay, in everything that you've talked about. You frame it in the form of questions. And you know what I have learned is that great questions are ones that set a future-oriented direction, a possibility-oriented direction, and that I don't know the answer to because they have implicit in them an invitation for others to join me. So they act as attractors. And at that point, it's invite the diversity of the system, knowing that it will never be complete. By definition, it isn't complete. But bring as much of the system as possible together so that we get the many perspectives and contexts and individual experiences, as Nora was talking about, so that we're in the space of potential for interaction. And then it's create a welcoming environment, welcome who and what shows up. That creates the stage that as things fall apart um, and they begin to differentiate in that period of experimentation, I see our work in designing for emergence as supporting the conditions that enable authentic individual expression and encourage connection, so that those random encounters, the interactions amongst the people who make up the system and the context in which the system exists, has the greatest playfield. And I think we see that big time going on. I read somewhere there are something like 116 different experiments going on that will hopefully lead to vaccines. Um, and there are many, many organizations across this country, across the US, that are dealing with issues of racial justice. So there is no one cookie cutter solution, but we encourage lots of experimentation. And slowly there's a clustering that begins to take place. And I see our role in design as listening for emerging coherence, for seeking meaning, for creating the conditions to reflect together such that emerging principles um, arise and that we hear them, around which a set of principles or insights about what we do now shows up. And of course, it's never complete, so it will be disruptive. And it takes us on this cycle again of asking generative questions, bringing together the diversity of the system, welcoming who and what shows up, um, to play and experiment together and listen for what's emerging. So that's the pattern that I have come to. That works at the level of individual, it works at the level of an organization. And based on the work I've been doing with journalism over the last 20 years, it feels really slow and like I'm spitting in the wind an awful lot, but we are beginning to see different outcomes arising.
It's wonderful. I just want to kind of bring up a tangential question of belonging and how this conversation connects with that. I just wanted to maybe use that as a pivot to our closing. I guess, like, how is this connecting for you with the concept of belonging?
I can jump in, but I've been doing the talking, so Sanjay, I defer to you.
I think belonging in many ways is also, in my mind, rooted around the ideas of agency, dignity, and choice. And hence, how do you induce that at scale? It's an interesting question. And that's why, for me, these topics are deeply connected. Because, for example, when the ecosystem here that I've been fortunate to work with was working on the subject of identity, and the National Identity Project came up in India, which currently services 1.2 billion people. How do you design that? Is a very, very, very interesting question. We could spend a day discussing just how do you design something like that. And the interesting thing that was done was to design it very similar to the way you think about very, very fundamental systems, which is answer one question. So this identity project essentially answers one question. You are who you say you are. That's it. It does nothing else. It's like GPS says you are here. It does nothing else. Now everybody else has to then make meaning of that answer, right? And so many a times, when I'm sort of thinking more and more about this question of belongingness, I haven't reached that question, but the question that's kind of boiling in my head is, what is that one question which is the root of belongingness, around which everything else is a layer, everything else is a composition? It's like all things that are timeless are always rooted in something fundamental, like music is rooted in fundamental notes. Art is rooted in a palette of colors. What are the roots of belongingness? And then everything else is just layers of context, layers of diversity, layers of different perspectives, situations, circumstances, what have you. And I think to create an emerging or an emergent system of belongingness, we have to get to that root of where does this begin? Does it begin in the sense of agency? Does it begin in my sense of dignity? Does it begin in the freedom of choice? And I think as we go through this process, all of us coming together and sort of boiling this pot, I'm hoping that designing emergent systems for belongingness would finally come down to this context-independent root on which we can create context-aware responses as relevant to different communities, different types of people in different situations, and context-intensive answers. And so that's the way I'm approaching this, saying that, is it possible to even unbundle, while Peggy said, maybe not unbundle, but can we unbundle belongingness to bring it down to what is the root of it, around which we can build the rest of the emergent system?
I think that is such a profound question. That is a gift, Sanjay. And as I find myself working with your question, I actually think belonging may be a root of emergence, because so much of disruption occurs when some aspect of the system is disrupting to get in because it doesn't feel like it belongs. Whether you're talking white nationalists or people who have experienced discrimination in our culture and feel left out, invisible, ignored, misunderstood, um, and make noise about it. The thing about disruption is that if it's ignored, it gets louder. And I often think that the cause of human disruption, I mean, there are other forms, certainly like viruses and hurricanes and so forth, um, but human disruption is often because we don't feel we belong. And actually, even natural disasters are because we've left the nature out of the equation. And so it lets us know that it also belongs. It's part of the system. And so fundamentally, and I think it's why part of the practice that I embrace asks the question, you know, who makes up the system? So that belonging is fundamental to how we approach whatever work we're doing when we're dealing with disruption, when we're dealing with not knowing. And at a really practical level, I'll offer an example from my friends Marv Weisbord and Sandra Janoff, who created a practice for bringing large groups together called Future Search. When they're in their planning, which is about creating, helping a system see itself. Um, the question they ask in terms of who needs to be in the room, they have an acronym. Who are the people who are in, with authority, resources, expertise, in information, and need? And so I find that a very helpful way of thinking about who to invite. Authority, resources, expertise, information, and need. It's just a handy rubric. I see I'm frozen, so hopefully you're still hearing me, but I'm going to stop my camera and start it again.
Yeah, we can hear you. I know that we're coming to close with our time, and I'd love any practices that you can share. Obviously, Peggy, you just shared one, and I guess like would make what would be different in the world, like if people were to pick up these practices and embody them? I think like that's the really final question that I'd love to learn more about from your perspectives.
Want to start or shall I? You're muted.
Oh, you're still muted.
Oh, can you hear me now? I'm so sorry. No, I was just saying that I don't think I have learned enough to be able to share a practice which others could do something with. What I do when I face large-scale complex systems is I try to ask one question, which is what, and all of us do that in the team, is what's the problem with the problem? And we keep doing that till we get to something so minimalistic, something so basic, something so simple that it gives us good goosebumps. And that's from where the journey begins. And that's been the quest in everything. Why is our healthcare system struggling? And then we go on this journey of unpeeling, unpacking, unpeeling, unpacking, till we can't get to a simpler answer. And that's a great place for us to begin, because we have learned probably, and we're still learning, is that putting that seed is the beginning of emergence. After that, the rest is a journey. And like Peggy rightly described, it's a very interesting power curve. For a long time, nothing happens. And then all of a sudden, a lot happens.
I actually want to say a variation on that, the importance of generative questions, I don't think can be understated. Something that the feedback of people who have told me that they were changed when they read in Engaging Emergence. And so what I often say to people is make friends with disruption. Um, and one of the best ways I have found to do that is to get curious um, and ask generative questions. And my version of your question, Sanjay, is given what's happening, what's possible now? Um, and I would say, finding curiosity and compassion in the face of disruption by asking great generative questions. And I think the difference that it makes in the world is that we would begin to see our differences as a source for coming to creative breakthrough rather than a reason to fight with each other.
I'm just basking in the collective wisdom of this group and seeing all the different threads we could follow. And I've been really enjoying following the live stream. And I think one of the emergent properties of conversation is watching people connect with each other from their different experience. And I caught myself sort of processing what someone had said on the live stream and losing what's track of this conversation and going back and forth. But yeah, I mean, just deep gratitude to all of you, and to Nora, who we'll loop back in later, for sharing your wisdom and your experience, and to Brandon for holding the space and drawing out some of these threads. I think it's, yeah, I'm resonating with both, Sanjay's humility here around we just don't know. And also, I think what makes this conversation so attractive to me personally is how much actually you do know. I mean, all of you, the three of you here, and Nora and others, are really at the forefront of practice. And also, I think what's super attractive to me about your work is the open source nature with which you share your learnings, through podcasts, Sanjay with Subtle Platform, Peggy, the fact that you publish your book and chapters freely available for folks is really just such a gift. And Brandon plays a lot in the open source technology space and the cooperative space. And so it feels like part of what Emergence is sharing what we're seeing so that others can riff off of it. So I really appreciated that spirit of this conversation. Just two quick thoughts by way of next steps, and then give folks one more round here and give Brandon the last word. So we have a couple more conversations coming up, so we'll be doing these throughout the summer. You can follow us on YouTube at Building Belonging. We're posting some of the readouts, some of what we're taking away from these conversations on Medium. You can follow us there at Building Belonging. We do have two conversations coming up that are unpacking different elements of what came up today. One is on identity formation and belonging. With some people in the chat were asking about, yeah, this sounds great. It's very cerebral. How do we embody it? What is the emotional affect of emergence of belonging? This conversation will get into that. And there's some really amazing humans that are going to be taking up that question. And then on the 23rd, next week, John Powell will be returning with a couple of folks, Valerie Kaur and Lucas Johnson, to talk about bridging and belonging. And bridging in this context is really this question that all of you have spoken to in different ways of how do we connect across difference? How do we create sufficient diversity on the one hand, and then create sufficient psychological safety and belonging on the other? So we'll try to transcend that binary. But deep appreciation to Sanjay and Peggy here, to Nora for joining us earlier, and to Brandon for holding the space. And Peggy, Sanjay, any quick last thoughts? And then Brandon can have the last word.
I'll just add something I was putting in the chat. One of my teachers and friends, Harrison Owen, who created the practice of open space technology, which supports groups to self-organize around what matters to them, has always made that practice free for the taking. And what he says about that in the generosity of giving it away is that your only responsibility, please use it, and your only responsibility is to share what you learn. And so I offer that in the spirit of this being a generative cycle, a virtuous cycle of gifting what we know. back so that others may learn.
Closing on a similar thought, all the knowledge we create is Creative Commons. All technology that we create, which we do create a lot of, is all open source. And the fundamental reason why we do it is because if you truly believe in large-scale emergent systems, the only way to build them is to build them on foundations of openness. Because if you can't be open, then the concept of emergence and belonging itself is taken away from the word go. And so that's not okay. So, and that's why we are more than excited to learn, to share, because every time we share, it forms new questions in our head. And that's the way we learn.
Yeah, thank you, Sanjay, Peggy, Nora, Brian. Such a wonderful and rich conversation. I have so much to take back to my own communities. And I also just wanted to close with a quote that Peggy sent me that I feel like is very true about today's conversation. The future is already here. It's just isn't very evenly distributed, by William Gibson. And I think like that speaks a lot to the life's work that you all have embarked on. And I'm eager to see how the future spreads. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
I'm going to shut off the live stream now.